sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary secrets. Picture this, a community track on a quiet Tuesday morning, filled with the usual suspects, weekend warriors huffing through their daily runs, elderly couples power walking in matching tracksuits, and a few serious athletes timing their laps. The atmosphere is relaxed, almost sleepy, punctuated by gentle conversations and the rhythmic slapping of sneakers on asphalt. Then someone notices the new guy. He's older than most, maybe in his 50s, wearing faded running shorts and a plain gray t-shirt that's seen better days. Nothing remarkable about him at first glance. Just another middle-aged man trying to stay in shape. He stretches casually by the fence, checks his watch with the unhurried manner of someone who has all the time in the world, and steps onto the track. That's when everything changes. What happens next will transform a routine morning workout into a moment that gets retold for years. Because sometimes, the most unassuming people carry the most incredible stories. And sometimes, a simple movement, a gesture so precise and practiced that it seems almost accidental, can reveal a lifetime of secrets that most people only see in movies. The laughter starts innocently enough, but it won't last long. Because when you've spent decades in the world's most elite military unit, some habits never fade, some skills become as natural as breathing. And some movements are so ingrained in muscle memory that they emerge without warning, even on a peaceful community track, where the biggest excitement should be someone's new personal record. This is the story of how a quiet Tuesday morning became the day when everything anyone thought they knew about the unassuming man in the gray t-shirt got turned completely upside down. The morning air carried the familiar scent of dew-dampened asphalt and freshly cut grass as the Riverside community track began to fill with its usual collection of early risers. Margaret Thompson adjusted her purple visor for the third time, stealing glances at her fitness tracker while she waited for her walking partner, Helen, to finish her elaborate stretching routine. At 72, Margaret had been walking this track for nearly a decade, and she knew every regular by name, running style, and preferred lap time. "Look at Jenkins trying to break his personal record again," Helen whispered, nodding toward the lean man in his 40s who was currently doing high knees near the starting line. "Third time this month. Poor fellow's going to pull something if he's not careful." Margaret chuckled, watching as Tom Jenkins launched into his run with the determined intensity of someone half his age. The track had become their morning entertainment, a live soap opera where the drama revolved around personal bests, new running shoes, and the occasional romantic subplot between the younger runners. The regulars were all there. Sarah Chen doing her pre-run yoga poses, the Martinez twins arguing about their workout playlist, and elderly Mr. Kowalski power walking with his distinctive arm-swinging technique that made him look like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. It was Tuesday, which meant the track would be less crowded than the weekend warrior invasion they experienced every Saturday and Sunday. That's when Margaret noticed him. The new guy stood by the chain-link fence that separated the track from the parking lot, methodically going through what appeared to be the most basic stretching routine she'd ever seen. No fancy yoga poses, no elaborate warm-up rituals, just simple, efficient movements that seemed almost businesslike in their execution. He looked to be in his early 50s, maybe a bit older, with graying hair that suggested he'd given up trying to hide the passage of time. His clothes were unremarkable. Faded navy running shorts that had definitely seen better days, a gray t-shirt with a small hole near the left shoulder, and running shoes that were clean but clearly well used. "New fellow," Helen observed, following Margaret's gaze. "Looks like he knows what he's doing, though. Good posture." Margaret nodded, watching as the man checked an old-fashioned digital watch, not one of the fancy fitness trackers that seem to adorn every wrist these days, but the kind of simple timepiece that valued function over form. There was something about his bearing that caught her attention, a certain economy of movement that spoke of someone who didn't waste energy on unnecessary gestures. The morning crowd continued their routines around him, but Margaret found herself studying the newcomer with growing curiosity. In her years of track watching, she'd developed an unofficial classification system for the runners and walkers who shared their morning sanctuary. There were the enthusiasts, who treated every workout like an Olympic trial, the socializers, who came as much for the conversation as the exercise, the strugglers who were fighting their own battles with fitness and often needed encouragement, and the naturals, Those rare individuals who moved with an easy grace that suggested athletics had always been part of their lives. This man didn't fit neatly into any of her categories. He finished his stretching with the same methodical approach he'd shown throughout, rolled his shoulders once, and stepped onto the track. No fanfare, no announcement of his presence. He simply began running with a stride that immediately set him apart from everyone else on the oval. "Well, would you look at that?" Helen murmured, her own walking forgotten as she watched the newcomer settle into his pace. The man's running form was unlike anything Margaret had seen during her years of track observation. It wasn't the flashy, high-energy style of someone trying to impress, nor the labored effort of someone pushing beyond their limits. Instead, he moved with a fluid efficiency that made running look effortless, his footfalls so light they barely seemed to disturb the track surface. His breathing appeared steady and controlled, his posture upright but relaxed. But it was more than just good technique that caught everyone's attention. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him run, a sense that every movement served a purpose, that nothing was wasted or excessive. He passed other runners without the usual huffing acknowledgement or forced smile of camaraderie that characterized most track interactions. Instead, he simply glided by, his focus entirely internal, as if he was running in a world separate from the community track surrounding him. Tom Jenkins, still pushing for his personal best, found himself unconsciously matching pace with the newcomer for half a lap before realizing he was working twice as hard to maintain the same speed. The Martinez twins stopped their playlist argument to watch the stranger's form, trying to identify what made his running look so different from their own. Even Mr. Kowalski paused his conducting routine to observe the new addition to their morning community. "He's military," Helen announced with the confidence of someone who'd raised 3 sons and could spot discipline from across a football field. "Has to be. Look at that posture." Margaret wasn't so sure. She'd seen military personnel at the track before. They usually announced their background through their intensity, their obvious physical conditioning, or their tendency to treat every run like a mission. This man seemed different. His conditioning was evident, but it was the kind of fitness that appeared natural rather than aggressively maintained. He wasn't pushing himself to impress anyone. He was simply running because that's what he did. As the newcomer completed his first lap, Margaret realized that the usual morning chatter had diminished considerably. People were watching him, not with the casual interest they might show a particularly fast runner, but with the kind of attention reserved for something unusual, something that didn't quite fit the normal patterns of their predictable morning routine. Sarah Chen abandoned her post-yoga meditation to observe the stranger's breathing technique. The Martinez twins had stopped running entirely and were standing by the fence, phones out, probably debating whether his form was worth recording for their running coach. Even the most self-absorbed runners seemed to be stealing glances, unconsciously comparing their own efforts to his seemingly effortless progress. The man appeared completely oblivious to the attention he was attracting. His focus remained internal, his pace steady, his form unchanged by the growing audience. He ran like someone who had been running for decades, but not in the way of a lifetime recreational athlete. This was different, more purposeful, more ingrained, as if running wasn't just exercise for him, but something closer to a fundamental life skill. By his third lap, Margaret had unconsciously stopped her own walking to watch. There was something almost meditative about observing his movement, a sense that she was witnessing someone who had achieved a level of physical mastery that most people never experienced. It wasn't about speed, though he was certainly moving at a respectable pace, but about the complete integration of movement, breathing, and mental focus that he displayed. 22 years Army, Mr. Kowalski announced, having abandoned his power walking to join the growing group of observers. "I can always tell. That's someone who learned to run with a full pack in combat boots." Helen nodded sagely, though Margaret noticed she was still staring at the newcomer with the same fascination that had gripped them all. There was something magnetic about watching someone who was truly expert at what they were doing, especially when that expertise was displayed without any apparent effort to show off or seek attention. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the track, but the usual rhythm of the community workout had been disrupted by the presence of one unremarkable-looking man who ran like he was born to it. Margaret realized she hadn't taken a step in over 10 minutes, completely absorbed in trying to understand what made this newcomer so compelling to watch. As he completed his fifth lap, showing no signs of fatigue or any change in his mechanical precision, Margaret began to wonder what other surprises this quiet Tuesday morning might hold, because in her experience, people who moved with that kind of unconscious competence usually had stories worth hearing, even if they were the type who would never volunteer to tell them. The track was about to become a much more interesting place. The newcomer had been running for nearly 30 minutes when the incident began to unfold, though at first, none of the track regulars recognized it as anything more than typical Tuesday morning chaos. The man had maintained his steady, hypnotic pace through 8 laps, drawing continued fascination from the growing crowd of observers who had largely abandoned their own workouts to watch him run. Margaret Thompson was just suggesting to Helen that they should probably resume their own walking when the commotion started near the parking lot. A young woman's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the morning air like a blade through the peaceful atmosphere they'd all been enjoying. "Help! Someone help me! He's got my purse." Everyone on the track turned toward the source of the shouting. A woman in her 20s, wearing scrubs that suggested she was either heading to or coming from a hospital shift, was standing next to her car with her driver's door open, pointing frantically down the street. About 50 yards away, a figure in dark clothing was running at full sprint, a brown leather purse clutched against his chest. "Call the police!" someone shouted from the track, and immediately there was a flurry of movement as people reached for their phones. The Martinez twins started jogging toward the fence, though their pace suggested they had no real intention of pursuing a purse snatcher. Tom Jenkins looked around wildly, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. Sarah Chen was already dialing 916, speaking rapidly into her phone. The thief was moving fast, taking advantage of the early morning quiet and the limited number of people on the street. He had a significant head start and was clearly counting on the fact that a group of morning exercisers wouldn't pose much of a threat to his escape plan. He was probably right. Most of the track regulars were past the age where chasing criminals seemed like a reasonable option. Margaret watched the scene unfold with growing frustration. The young woman was clearly distraught, and the thief was already reaching the first intersection, where he would likely disappear into the maze of residential streets that surrounded the park. Even if the police responded quickly, the chances of catching him seemed minimal. That's when she realized the newcomer had stopped running. The man in the gray t-shirt stood motionless on the track, his head turned toward the commotion, his body language completely different from the relaxed, meditative state he'd maintained throughout his run. Something had changed in his posture, a subtle shift that reminded Margaret of a dog hearing a sound that humans couldn't detect. He wasn't moving, but every line of his body suggested he was processing information at lightning speed. Helen grabbed Margaret's arm. "Look at him," she whispered. "Something's different." The newcomer's stillness lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for the thief to gain another 20 yards, long enough for the woman's shouts to become more desperate, long enough for the other track users to fumble with their phones and debate whether anyone should attempt pursuit. 3 seconds that felt much longer to everyone watching. Then he moved. What happened next was unlike anything Margaret had witnessed in her 70. The man didn't simply start running toward the fence that separated the track from the street. Instead, he exploded into motion with a speed and intensity that transformed him from a quiet, middle-aged runner into something entirely different. His first 3 steps covered more ground than seemed physically possible. By his 4th step, he was already at the fence, not slowing down to look for a gate or an opening, but approaching the 4-foot chain-link barrier as if it were merely a minor inconvenience. Without breaking stride, he placed one hand on the top of the fence and vaulted over it with a fluid grace that made the obstacle disappear beneath him. "Holy shit!" Tom Jenkins breathed, speaking for everyone on the track. But the fence vault was just the beginning. Once the man hit the sidewalk on the far side, his running style changed completely from the steady, meditative pace they'd been watching for the past half hour. Now he was moving with predatory speed, his stride lengthening and quickening in a way that suggested he had been holding back significantly during his casual track workout. The thief, who had probably assumed he was safely away from any pursuit, made the mistake of looking back over his shoulder. Margaret could see the exact moment when he spotted the gray-shirted figure closing the distance between them at an impossible rate. The criminal's confident sprint immediately became more frantic, but it was already too late. The newcomer was covering ground with mechanical precision, his feet barely seeming to touch the pavement as he ate up the yards between himself and his target. There was nothing wasted in his movement. No excess arm swing, no inefficient breathing, no sign of the all-out effort his speed would have required from anyone else. He ran like a machine designed specifically for pursuit, and Margaret realized with growing amazement that they were witnessing someone operate at a level of physical capability that most people never achieved.
"He's going to catch him," Sarah Chen said into her phone, momentarily forgetting she was supposed to be talking to the 911 operator. "There's someone chasing the thief, and he's actually going to catch him." The gap between pursuer and pursued closed with mathematical inevitability. 50 yards became 30, then 20, then 10. The thief, realizing his situation was becoming desperate, made a sharp right turn into a residential street, probably hoping to find somewhere to hide or another route of escape. The newcomer took the corner without slowing down, his body leaning into the turn with perfect balance, maintaining his speed as if the change of direction was just another minor detail in his pursuit. Margaret found herself holding her breath, unable to look away from what felt like watching a nature documentary about a predator closing in on its prey. From the track, they could still see portions of the chase as it moved through the neighborhood streets. The man in the gray t-shirt was no longer just closing distance. He was gaining on the thief with each stride, his superior conditioning and technique becoming more apparent with every passing second. "Who is that guy?" the Martinez twins asked in unison, echoing the question that was probably occurring to everyone watching. The pursuit disappeared briefly behind a row of houses, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When they next caught sight of the chase, the newcomer was only a few feet behind, the increasingly desperate thief, close enough that Margaret could see the criminal starting to panic as he realized escape was no longer possible. What happened next would have seemed choreographed if anyone had been prepared for it. The thief, in a last-ditch effort to evade capture, suddenly stopped and spun around, swinging the purse at his pursuer's head in what was probably meant to be a disabling blow. The man in the gray t-shirt didn't dodge, duck, or try to block the attack. Instead, he simply wasn't there when the purse arrived where his head had been a split second earlier. He had moved, not with the obvious motion of someone stepping aside, but with a subtle shift that put him exactly where he needed to be to avoid the strike while simultaneously positioning himself for what came next. His response was so quick, so precise, that Margaret almost missed it despite watching intently. One moment the thief was swinging a purse at empty air, off balance from his missed attack. The next moment he was on the ground, the purse flying free, the newcomer standing over him with one foot placed carefully but firmly on the criminal's back. The entire sequence, from the man's leap over the fence to the thief's capture, had taken less than 2 minutes. "Did you see that move?" Mr. Kowalski asked, his voice filled with amazement. "The way he took that guy down? That wasn't luck. That was training." Margaret realized she was still holding her breath. The casual morning runner they'd been observing for the past 30 minutes had just demonstrated physical capabilities that belonged in action movies, not on community tracks. The economy of movement she'd noticed in his running had been just a hint of what he was actually capable of when the situation demanded it. The young woman whose purse had been stolen was already running toward the scene, her face a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Other people from the neighborhood were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion. In the distance, Margaret could hear sirens approaching, the police response Sarah Chen had requested. But all of that seemed secondary to the questions that were multiplying in Margaret's mind. Who was the man in the gray t-shirt? What kind of training produced the ability to pursue and capture a fleeing criminal with such apparent ease? And perhaps most intriguingly, how many other people moved through their daily lives carrying capabilities that only emerged when circumstances demanded them? The track regulars stood in stunned silence, watching as their quiet Tuesday morning was transformed into something that would be retold and embellished for months to come. None of them had gotten more than casual exercise that day, but they had all witnessed something extraordinary. A moment when an ordinary-looking person had revealed himself to be anything but ordinary. As the police cars arrived and the formal business of statements and reports began, Margaret found herself studying the man in the gray t-shirt with new eyes. He had returned to his calm, unassuming demeanor, speaking quietly with the officers and the young woman whose property he had recovered. But now she could see hints of what they had all missed during his peaceful run around their community track. The way he positioned himself when talking to the police officers, casual but alert, relaxed but ready. The manner in which he answered questions, complete but economical,
helpful but not eager to elaborate. The fact that subduing a purse snatcher had left him barely breathing hard, despite the sprint and physical confrontation it had required. Margaret realized that their morning entertainment had just become much more interesting, and she had a feeling that the story of the newcomer in the gray t-shirt was just getting started. The police paperwork took nearly an hour, during which most of the track regulars lingered nearby, their morning routines completely forgotten in favor of witnessing the aftermath of what was already being called the most exciting thing to happen at Riverside Track since old Mrs. Patterson's infamous confrontation with the geese in 2019. The newcomer answered questions with the same methodical efficiency he'd shown in everything else, providing clear, concise responses while maintaining the same unassuming demeanor he'd displayed throughout his run. Margaret Thompson found herself studying his interaction with the officers with growing fascination. He wasn't defensive or eager to please, didn't embellish his account or seek recognition for his actions. Instead, he treated the questioning as simply another task to be completed properly, answering what was asked without volunteering additional information. When Officer Rodriguez asked about his background, wondering if he had law enforcement or military experience that explained his effective response, the man simply said he'd picked up a few things over the years and left it at that.
"Name's Jack Morrison," she heard him tell the officer, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of giving orders in challenging conditions, though his current tone was conversational rather than commanding. "I live about 6 blocks from here. Was just out for a morning run when I heard the commotion." The young woman whose purse had been recovered, introduced as Kelly Martinez, an emergency room nurse heading home from a night shift, couldn't stop thanking him. Her gratitude was genuine and effusive, but Jack Morrison accepted it with the same quiet politeness he'd shown the police officers, deflecting her praise as if what he'd done was no more remarkable than picking up something she'd dropped. Really wasn't a big deal, he kept saying, though everyone who had witnessed the chase knew better. Right place, right time. Glad I could help. When the official business was concluded and the police had taken the purse snatcher away in handcuffs, the track regulars expected Jack Morrison to resume his run or perhaps head home. Instead, he surprised them by walking back toward the track, apparently intending to continue his workout as if nothing unusual had happened. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret called out as he approached the fence, her curiosity finally overcoming her usual Midwestern reserve. "That was quite impressive, what you did. Would you mind if we asked where you learned to move like that?" He paused, one hand on the fence gate, and for a moment Margaret thought he might deflect the question like he had with the police officer. But then he seemed to consider the group of faces looking at him with genuine interest rather than mere curiosity, and his expression softened slightly. "Military," he said simply. "Long time ago now." "Which branch?" Mr. Kowalski asked, his own army background evident in the way he straightened his posture slightly. "Navy," Jack replied, then added after a brief hesitation, "Special Operations." The effect of those 2 words on the assembled group was immediate and electric. Special Operations meant Navy SEALs, and everyone knew what that implied, even if most of them had only seen such elite soldiers in movies or television shows. The quiet man in the faded running shorts and gray t-shirt had just revealed that he belonged to one of the most exclusive military fraternities in the world. "SEALs?" Tom Jenkins breathed, his voice carrying the same reverence most people reserved for meeting celebrities. Jack nodded once, a gesture that managed to be both confirmatory and dismissive, as if he was acknowledging the fact, while simultaneously indicating it wasn't something he particularly wanted to discuss in detail. But the revelation explained everything they had witnessed. The effortless running form, the explosive speed when action was required, the precise takedown of the purse snatcher, the calm professionalism with the police officers. "How long were you in?" Sarah Chen asked, her phone forgotten in her hand as she processed this new information. 24 years, Jack replied. Retired about 5 years ago. The Martinez twins exchanged glances, clearly recalculating everything they thought they knew about fitness and conditioning. Here was someone who had spent over 2 decades in what was arguably the most physically demanding job in the military, and he was casually using their community track for what was apparently a light workout. "Those moves you used on the thief," Helen said, her voice filled with curiosity. "Is that something they teach all SEALs, or were you some kind of specialist?" For the first time since the incident began,
Jack Morrison's composed expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. "They teach us a lot of things," he said carefully, "most of which aren't really necessary for civilian life. Today was just basic stuff, pursuit and apprehension. Nothing fancy." Margaret nearly laughed at his description of basic stuff, thinking about the vault over the fence and the precision of his takedown technique. If that was basic, she could only imagine what Jack Morrison's idea of fancy might involve. "Were you deployed overseas? Mr. Teleporting Bag sent?" Kowalski asked his question carrying the weight of someone who understood that combat experience left marks on people that weren't always visible. "Few times," Jack replied, his tone indicating this was as much detail as he planned to provide on that particular topic. Iraq, Afghanistan, some other places. The casual mention of other places sent a small thrill through the group. In their world of morning walks and personal running records, they were suddenly in the presence of someone who had operated in shadowy corners of international conflict that most people only read about in newspapers or saw dramatized in movies. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked softly. "The military, I mean." Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the assembled faces to the track beyond them, then to some point in the distance that none of them could see. When he finally answered, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there during his matter-of-fact responses to the earlier questions. "Miss the guys," he said. "Miss having a clear mission. Miss knowing that what you're doing matters." He paused, then added with what might have been a slight smile, "Don't miss getting shot at, though." The comment drew nervous laughter from the group, but Margaret caught something else in his tone, a note of loss that suggested the transition from military to civilian life hadn't been entirely smooth. She wondered how many former special operations soldiers struggled with finding purpose and excitement in normal daily routines after spending careers in situations where life-or-death decisions were routine. "What do you do now?" Tom Jenkins asked. "For work, I mean." "Security consulting," Jack replied. "Corporate stuff? Mostly. Risk assessment? Personnel protection for executives. Pays well? Keeps me busy." His tone suggested that while the work might be profitable, it wasn't particularly fulfilling compared to his previous career. "Is that why you stay in such good shape?" Helen asked, gesturing toward his obviously excellent physical condition. "For the consulting work?" "Partly," Jack admitted, "but mostly just habit at this point. Hard to break patterns you've followed for 20-plus years. Plus, you never know when you might need to chase down a purse snatcher." This drew genuine laughter from the group, and Margaret noticed that the comment seemed to ease some of the tension that had built up around the revelation of his background. Jack Morrison might be a former Navy SEAL with combat experience in classified locations, but he was also just a guy who used their community track for morning runs and was willing to help a stranger in trouble. "Will we see you here regularly?" Margaret asked, realizing that she very much hoped the answer would be yes. The track had suddenly become a much more interesting place, and not just because of the morning's excitement. "Most mornings," Jack confirmed. "I live pretty close by, and this is a good place to run without dealing with traffic or crowds." He paused, then added, "Assuming today's excitement isn't typical. I'm looking for peaceful workouts, not more adventure." "Oh, this kind of thing never happens here," Ellen assured him quickly. "You just happened to arrive on the one morning in 5 years when someone needed rescuing. Usually, the biggest drama is Tom trying to beat his personal record or Sarah's ongoing feud with the sprinkler system." "Hey," Tom protested good-naturedly, "I'm going to break that record eventually. And the sprinklers have it coming," Sarah added with mock seriousness. "They've been targeting me specifically for months." The easy banter seemed to relax Jack further, and Margaret could see him beginning to fit into the social dynamic of their morning community. It occurred to her that he might need this normalcy as much as they were enjoying his presence, a place where he could just be a middle-aged guy out for a run, where his extraordinary background was interesting but not defining. As the group began to disperse, people finally remembering that they had come to the track for exercise rather than excitement, Jack Morrison prepared to resume his interrupted workout. But the morning had changed something fundamental in the dynamic of their small community. They were no longer just a collection of individuals who happened to exercise in the same location. They had become people who had shared an extraordinary experience together. Margaret lingered as the others headed back to their routines, watching Jack stretch in preparation for completing his run. She found herself wondering what other capabilities and experiences were walking around in apparently ordinary people, hidden behind unremarkable exteriors and quiet daily routines.
"Thank you," she said as he prepared to step back onto the track. "For helping that young woman, I mean, but also for sharing a bit about yourself with us. I hope you'll feel comfortable here."
Jack looked at her for a moment, and she saw something in his expression that suggested her words had meant more to him than his casual acknowledgement indicated. "Thanks," he said simply.
"I think I will."
As he resumed his run, settling back into the same fluid, efficient stride they had admired before the morning's excitement, Margaret realized that the Riverside Community Track had just gained not only a new regular member, but also a living reminder that extraordinary people moved among them every day, carrying stories and capabilities that only emerged when circumstances demanded them. The track would never quite seem ordinary again. Over the following weeks, Jack Morrison's presence at the Riverside Community Track transformed what had been a predictable morning routine into something approaching appointment television. The track regulars found themselves arriving earlier and staying later, drawn by the possibility of witnessing another demonstration of capabilities that belonged in action movies rather than suburban exercise routines. But more than that, they were fascinated by the glimpses into a world most of them had only imagined. Jack, for his part, seemed to settle into the community with an ease that surprised everyone, including Margaret Thompson, who had appointed herself the unofficial social coordinator of their morning group. He maintained his methodical approach to everything, arriving at precisely the same time each day, following the same stretching routine, running the same number of laps at the same steady pace. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to open up to the questions and curiosity of his fellow exercisers. It started with small details, casual comments dropped during conversations that revealed fragments of a career most people couldn't imagine. When Tom Jenkins complained about struggling with his breathing during longer runs, Jack mentioned that he'd once had to swim 2 miles underwater using rebreathers, making Tom's cardio concerns seem suddenly manageable. When Sarah Chen wondered aloud about the best way to handle aggressive dog that had been menacing joggers in her neighborhood, Jack suggested a specific technique for reading animal body language that he'd learned while working with military dogs in combat zones. Each casual revelation opened new windows into experiences that sounded like fiction but were delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting a routine workday. The track regulars found themselves collecting these fragments, piecing together a picture of a career that had encompassed far more than most of them had initially imagined. 24 years is a long time in special operations, Mr. Kowalski observed one morning as they watched Jack complete his warm-up routine with characteristic precision. Most guys burn out or get forced into desk jobs long before that. Jack overheard the comment and paused in his stretching. "I was lucky," he said, his tone suggesting the luck hadn't all been good. "Got to stay operational longer than most. Team leadership positions kept me in the field instead of behind a desk." "Team leader?" Helen asked, the implications immediately apparent to everyone within earshot. "Eventually," Jack confirmed. "Started as an operator, worked my way up. By the end, I was running missions, making the calls about where we went and what we did." Margaret felt a small thrill at the casual way he discussed responsibilities that most people associated with Hollywood heroes. Here was someone who had been trusted with decisions that affected national security, who had led teams of elite soldiers into situations where failure could have international consequences. "What was the scariest mission you ever went on?" the Martinez twins asked in unison, their question drawing disapproving looks from the older track members who thought such direct inquiries might be inappropriate. But Jack didn't seem offended. He considered the question seriously while adjusting his watch, then shook his head slightly. "Scariest missions were usually the ones where we didn't have good intelligence," he said. "Going into situations where you don't know what you're going to find, who might be waiting for you, what the ground looks like. Fear keeps you alive in that business, but uncertainty is what really gets to you." "Did you ever get wounded?" Sarah Chen asked, her medical background evident in her clinical curiosity about the physical toll of his career. Jack rolled up the sleeve of his t-shirt, revealing a scar that ran from his elbow nearly to his shoulder. a white line against his tan skin that spoke of serious trauma and professional medical attention. "Few times," he said, pulling the sleeve back down. Occupational hazard. This one was from shrapnel in Afghanistan. Purple Heart number 2. The casual mention of multiple Purple Hearts awards given to military personnel wounded in action sent a ripple of awe through the group. They were looking at someone who had not only served in combat, but had been decorated for injuries sustained while doing so, and he discussed it with the same emotional investment he might show when talking about old sports injuries. "Purple Heart number 2? Tom Jenkins repeated. "How many did you end up with?" "3 total," Jack replied, then seemed to realize how that might sound. "Sounds worse than it was. I was good at my job, but I wasn't particularly good at staying out of trouble. My team used to joke that I attracted hostile fire." "What was your specialty?" "Mr. Call." Kowalski asked his military experience, giving him context for asking more specific questions. "Within the teams, I mean. Everyone's got their particular skills." "Started as a breacher," Jack said, beginning his run as he talked, forcing the others to walk alongside the track to continue the conversation. Explosives, getting through barriers, opening up buildings. Later moved into reconnaissance and direct action. By the end, I was doing a lot of hostage rescue and high-value target operations. Margaret found herself trying to process what high-value target operations might involve, though she suspected the reality would be both more complex and more disturbing than anything she could imagine. The fact that Jack discussed it so casually suggested that extraordinary violence had become routine for him, just another aspect of a job that required skills most people never developed. "Hostage rescue must have been intense," Sarah observed, jogging slowly to keep pace with his walking speed conversation, all that pressure to get everything exactly right. "That was actually some of the most satisfying work," Jack said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine enthusiasm they'd heard when he discussed his military career. "When it goes right, when you get everyone out alive, there's no feeling like it. You're literally saving lives, usually people who thought they were going to die. Makes all the other stuff worthwhile." "Did you ever lose hostages?" Helen asked quietly, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, that was probably too personal." But Jack didn't seem bothered by the question. "Few times," he acknowledged. "Not many, but enough to stay with you. That's the hardest part of the job, knowing that someone's life depends on your decisions, your timing, your team's execution. When it goes wrong," he paused, his stride remaining steady even as his voice carried the weight of old regret. "Those are the ones that wake you up at night, even years later." The admission of vulnerability from someone who seemed so supremely capable created a moment of quiet among the group. Margaret realized they were getting a glimpse not just of remarkable achievements, but of the psychological cost of a career built around life and death decisions. "Is that why you retired?" Tom asked gently. "The stress of it all?" "Partly," Jack said, "but mainly I just got old for the job. Special operations is a young man's game. When you start slowing down even a little bit, when your reflexes aren't quite what they were, it's time to step aside before you get your teammates killed." The matter-of-fact way he discussed the possibility of causing deaths through diminished performance was sobering. In their world, getting older meant slower running times or needing reading glasses. In Jack's former world, it had meant the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. "Do you miss the adrenaline?" Sarah asked. "Going from that level of intensity to security consulting must be quite an adjustment." Jack was quiet for several strides, and Margaret could see him considering how much to reveal about his transition to civilian life. When he finally answered, there was an honesty in his voice that suggested he didn't often discuss this particular struggle. "Miss it every day," he admitted. "Not the danger specifically, but the sense of purpose. When you're doing that job, every day matters. Every decision could save lives or prevent something terrible from happening." Corporate security consulting, he shrugged. "It pays well, but it's hard to feel like you're making a real difference when you're protecting some CEO's golf tournament from imaginary threats." The admission revealed something important about Jack Morrison that all his stories about combat and decorated service hadn't quite conveyed. Despite his extraordinary background and obvious capabilities, he was struggling with the same search for meaning and purpose that affected many people transitioning between career phases. The difference was that his previous career had involved responsibilities and excitement levels that made normal civilian work seem trivial by comparison. "Have you thought about law enforcement?" Mr. Kowalski suggested. "With your background, you could probably write your own ticket with any police department or federal agency." "Considered it," Jack said. "But honestly, I'm not sure I want to go back to carrying a gun every day, even in a different context. Part of retirement was supposed to be stepping away from situations where violence is always a possibility. Yet you chased down that purse snatcher," Margaret pointed out with a smile. "Some habits die hard, I suppose." Jack laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "Fair point. Guess 24 years of training doesn't just switch off because you hang up the uniform. But that was just helping a neighbor, not looking for trouble." "Good thing for Kelly Martinez that your training doesn't switch off," Helen observed. "She still talks about what you did every time she sees one of us at the grocery store. Says you're her hero." "She's a nice kid," Jack said, deflecting the praise as he always did. "ER nurse working night shifts, just trying to make a living and help people. Deserved better than having some punk steal her purse." The protective note in his voice when discussing Kelly Martinez revealed another aspect of Jack's character that was becoming apparent the more time they spent with him. Despite his lethal capabilities and warrior background, or perhaps because of them, he had a strong instinct to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. As the conversation wound down and people began to focus on their individual workouts, Margaret found herself reflecting on how much their morning community had changed since Jack's arrival. They were no longer just people who happened to exercise at the same place and time. They had become a group bound together by shared fascination with someone whose life experiences were unlike anything they had encountered. But more than that, Jack's presence had given them all a new perspective on the extraordinary potential that might exist in apparently ordinary people. His stories were compelling, but his ordinariness in daily life was equally remarkable. He was living proof that heroes weren't necessarily obvious, that exceptional capabilities could be hidden behind unremarkable exteriors and quiet daily routines. The track had become a place where the extraordinary and mundane intersected, where a decorated war veteran could find community among morning walkers and weekend joggers, where stories that belonged in movies were shared during casual conversations about fitness and neighborhood life. Margaret had a feeling their education about Jack Morrison's background was far from complete, and she looked forward to discovering what other revelations their quiet new friend might share in the days to come. The revelation that would transform Jack Morrison from intriguing new community member to local legend came on a Thursday morning in late autumn, 6 weeks after the purse-snatching incident that had first revealed his extraordinary background. The track was quieter than usual. Several regulars were dealing with seasonal colds, and the crisp October air had discouraged some of the more casual exercisers. But Margaret Thompson, Helen, and a core group of the most dedicated walkers and runners were present for what would become the most remarkable conversation any of them had ever experienced. The morning had started typically enough. Jack completed his methodical warm-up routine, began his usual run, and gradually drew the others into conversation as they maintained their own exercise routines. But something was different about his demeanor, less guarded, more relaxed, as if the weeks of gradual acceptance into their community had finally convinced him that these morning companions were genuinely interested in him as a person rather than simply fascinated by his exotic background. The shift became apparent when Tom Jenkins, still nursing his ongoing obsession with improving his running times, asked Jack about mental techniques for pushing through physical barriers during challenging workouts. "In the teams, we called it embracing the suck," Jack said, maintaining his steady pace as he spoke. "The idea that discomfort is temporary but quitting lasts forever. When your body starts telling you to stop, that's usually when the real work begins." "Sounds like something you learned the hard way," Sarah Chen observed, matching her walking pace to his running speed so she could participate in the conversation. "Oh, yeah," Jack confirmed. "Hell Week alone was enough to teach you that lesson permanently. But the real education came later, during actual operations, when failure wasn't an option and comfort was a luxury you couldn't afford." "Hell Week?" Helen asked. "Is that the famous SEAL training everyone hears about?" Jack nodded. "First phase of Bud/S. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. 5.5 days of continuous physical activity with maybe 4 hours of sleep total. designed to weed out anyone who might fold under pressure when lives are on the line. The casual mention of the legendarily difficult military training immediately drew the attention of everyone within earshot. Hell Week was something they'd all heard about in movies or documentaries, but none of them had ever met anyone who had actually survived it. What percentage of people make it through? Mr. Kowalski asked, his own military background giving him context for understanding the significance of such specialized selection processes. My class started with about 180 guys, Jack said. 26 of us graduated. Hell Week alone probably knocked out 60% of those who were left by that point. Margaret tried to process the mathematics of that selection rate. The man running easily beside them had been chosen from an extraordinarily small group of individuals deemed capable of meeting the military's most demanding standards. It was like discovering that their quiet morning companion had been selected from thousands of applicants for the world's most exclusive and challenging job. Were you ever tempted to quit? The Martinez twins asked, their voices carrying the awe that the older track members had learned to suppress when discussing Jack's background. Every day, Jack admitted without hesitation. Hell Week especially. There were moments when hypothermia was setting in, when we'd been carrying boats over our heads for hours, when instructors were screaming at us and we were so tired we couldn't think straight, moments when quitting seemed like the most logical thing in the world. What kept you going? Margaret asked, genuinely curious about the mental processes that allowed someone to persist through experiences designed to break most people. Jack was quiet for several strides, and she could see him considering how to explain something that was probably difficult to put into words. When he finally answered, his voice carried a depth of conviction that made clear this wasn't just a motivational slogan but a fundamental aspect of his character. Partly it was not wanting to let down the guys who were suffering right alongside me, he said. But mostly it was knowing that if I quit, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have made it. I'd rather fail trying than succeed at giving up. The simple honesty of the statement resonated with everyone listening. Here was someone who had faced extraordinary challenges, not because he was naturally superior or immune to difficulty, but because he had made a conscious choice to persist despite suffering and uncertainty. Did you know right away that you wanted to be a SEAL? Sarah asked. Or was it something you discovered along the way? Actually started as a regular Navy guy, Jack said, his tone carrying a note of amusement at the memory. Enlisted right out of high school, figured the military would give me some direction and help pay for college eventually. Did a couple of years on a destroyer, got bored, heard about this thing called SEALs. Sounded like it might be more interesting than routine ship duties. More interesting, Ellen repeated with a laugh. That's certainly one way to describe combat operations. Seemed like a good idea at the time. The conversation might have continued in this lighter vein, but Tom Jenkins asked the question that would change everything they thought they knew about their modest morning companion. In all those years, all those missions, did you ever do anything that made the news? Something we might have read about or seen on television? Jack's running stride didn't change, but something shifted in his expression, a momentary calculation, as if he was deciding whether to share information he rarely discussed. After a long pause, he seemed to make a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Remember the cargo ship hijacking about 8 years ago? He asked quietly. The Maersk, Alabama situation in the Indian Ocean? American crew taken hostage by Somali pirates? Everyone nodded. The story had dominated headlines for days. An American cargo vessel seized by armed pirates. The crew held at gunpoint while negotiations dragged on with no clear resolution in sight. The situation had seemed hopeless until, suddenly, dramatically, it wasn't. The hostages had been rescued in a precision operation that left the pirates dead and the crew unharmed. I was there, Jack said simply. The words hit the group like a physical impact. They had all followed that story, had all watched the news coverage, and felt relief when the hostages were rescued, but they had never imagined they would meet someone who had actually participated in the operation. You were part of the rescue team? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Team leader, Jack confirmed. My guys and I fast-dropped from helicopters onto that ship at 3 a.m. Had about 15 minutes to locate and extract 12 hostages while neutralizing 6 armed pirates without causing casualties among the crew. The casual way he described an operation that had been front-page news around the world was both thrilling and sobering. Margaret realized she was looking at someone who had quite literally made history, who had been responsible for saving lives in a situation the entire world had been watching. The news coverage made it look like it was over in minutes, Sarah said. Was it really that quick? The actual assault was fast, Jack agreed. But we'd been planning and rehearsing for 3 days before we got the green light. Intelligence gathering, studying the ship's layout, coordinating with Navy snipers, timing everything down to the second. By the time we hit the ship, we knew exactly where everyone was and what each team member's job would be.
Were you scared? Helen asked softly.
Jack considered the question seriously. Terrified, he admitted. 12 civilians depending on us to get it right, pirates with automatic weapons who had nothing to lose, international media watching every move. The margin for error was basically zero. But you did it anyway, Mr. Kowalski observed. That's the job, Jack said. Being scared doesn't change what needs to be done. If anything, fear makes you more careful, more thorough in your planning. The guys who aren't scared are the ones who make mistakes. The revelation about the Maersk, Alabama rescue recontextualized everything they thought they knew about Jack Morrison. He wasn't just a former special operations soldier with interesting stories. He was someone who had played a central role in a major international incident, whose decisions and actions had been scrutinized by governments around the world. Did you get any recognition for that? Tom asked. Medals or commendations? Silver Star, Jack said quietly. And the guys got bronze stars. But honestly, the best recognition was seeing those crew members reunite with their families. That made everything worthwhile. The Silver Star, Margaret knew from her late husband's military service, was one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. She was looking at someone who had not only participated in extraordinary events but had been officially recognized for exceptional heroism. Were there other operations like that? The Martinez twins asked. Other rescues that made the news? Few over the years, Jack acknowledged. Embassy evacuation in Libya during the Civil War. Counter-terrorism stuff in Syria and Iraq. Most of it doesn't make the news, or if it does, they don't mention who was involved. Operational security and all that. Each casual mention of major international events was like a small explosion of realization for his audience. They were talking to someone who had been present at multiple moments of recent history, who had been trusted with missions that affected international relations and global security. The embassy evacuation, Sarah said suddenly, recognition dawning in her voice. Was that the one where they got the ambassador and his staff out just before the compound was overrun? Jack nodded. That was us. Came down to the last few minutes. Had to fight our way out with diplomats and intelligence personnel while the whole city was falling apart around us. The understated way he described what must have been a harrowing experience under extreme pressure made clear that such operations had been routine parts of his career. What seemed like Hollywood fiction to his listeners had been just another day at work for Jack Morrison. How do you go from that, Margaret asked, gesturing to encompass the magnitude of what he'd just described, to running laps at a community track? How do you make that transition? It was perhaps the most personal question anyone had asked, and Jack's answer revealed more about his current struggles than all his war stories combined. That's the thing nobody prepares you for, he said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability they hadn't heard before. When your job is saving lives and protecting people, when every decision matters and you're trusted with responsibilities that affect thousands of people, stepping back into regular civilian life can feel empty, like nothing you do matters as much. The honesty of his admission created a moment of profound quiet among the group. Here was someone who had achieved more than most people could imagine, who had been recognized for extraordinary heroism and service, but who was struggling with the same search for meaning and purpose that affected everyone facing major life transitions. But you're finding your way, Helen said gently. You helped that young woman. You've become part of our community here. That matters too. Jack's expression softened, and Margaret could see that her words had touched something important in him. Yeah, he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. I'm starting to figure that out. Thanks to all of you, actually. Turns out community and friendship matter more than I realized. As the morning progressed and people gradually returned to their individual routines, Margaret found herself processing everything they had learned about their quiet companion. Jack Morrison wasn't just a former military member with interesting stories. He was someone who had shaped recent history, who had saved lives on an international stage, who had been trusted with responsibilities that most people couldn't comprehend. But perhaps more importantly, he was also someone who had chosen to share that extraordinary background with a group of ordinary people who had shown interest in him as a person. He had trusted them with stories that revealed both his remarkable achievements and his current vulnerabilities, creating a bond that transformed their casual morning exercise routine into something approaching family. The track would never be the same, but then again, neither would any of them. They had all been changed by the presence of someone who proved that heroes walked among them in unremarkable clothes and quiet daily routines, carrying stories that could inspire and amaze, but who needed community and friendship just like everyone else. As Margaret watched Jack complete his final lap, moving with the same fluid efficiency that had first caught her attention weeks ago, she realized that the most extraordinary thing about him wasn't his decorated military career or his involvement in international incidents. It was his ability to find meaning and connection in the simple act of sharing morning exercises with a group of suburban neighbors who had become, unexpectedly and completely, his friends. The laughter that had originally filled the track when people first noticed Jack's unusual running style had been replaced by something deeper and more lasting: respect, admiration, and genuine affection for someone who had shown them that extraordinary capabilities and ordinary humanity could coexist in the same person. Their community had gained not just a member, but a living reminder that heroes were real, that they moved among regular people carrying incredible stories, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant shores, but in the daily struggle to find purpose, connection, and meaning in civilian life. The story that had started with laughter and surprise had evolved into something much more significant, a testament to the transformative power of community, the hidden depths of apparently ordinary people, and the ongoing journey of someone learning that heroism comes in many forms, including the simple act of showing up every morning to run with friends who had become family. Laughter filled the track until they recognized a legendary SEAL move.